Hello, I'm Phil Bear, and I'm the host of the podcast called The Cross to Bear. And today I'm going to do a little bit of a response to a review of one of the chapters in my book, Machines Don't Laugh. So I sent the podcaster who calls herself Godless Granny a copy of my book, Machines Don't Laugh. She posted a review of the chapter called Which God is Right for You? And what stands out immediately in her treatment of that chapter is not merely disagreement, but a consistent failure to engage the argument that was actually made. So she substitutes a different target, critiques that substitute, and then presents the result as though she has engaged the chapter on its own terms. And that pattern runs throughout her review. So the first point that needs to be made plainly is this. The purpose of Machines Don't Laugh is not to catalog religions or to adjudicate between Zeus, Odin, Yahweh, and every other named deity. The purpose is to expose the internal incoherence of atheism and then argue on cognitive and metaphysical grounds that God exists. That means the argument operates within a shared conceptual framework that both atheists and theists already recognize. So when I use the term God, I'm not referring to any being that happens to be called a god in ancient mythology. When I say my working definition of God is the being atheists say doesn't exist, Godless Granny didn't read the plain English of that sentence. She thought it said any being that any atheist says doesn't exist. I'm referring to the ultimate non-contingent source of reality, and that is the category in dispute. That is a category the chapter addresses. So any thinking atheist and any competent philosopher will understand that immediately. So when she opens by claiming that the chapter does not answer its own title, she immediately misidentifies the task. The question, which God is right for you, is not answered by listing religious options. It is answered by identifying what would have to be true of any being worthy of the title God in the relevant metaphysical sense. The chapter answers that by arguing from contingency. It shows that the kinds of gods Loftus and others bring up, clumsy gods, weak gods, deceiver gods, dead gods, are contingent and therefore cannot be the ultimate source of contingent reality. That is an answer. She may reject it, but she's not earning any credibility points by pretending it's not there. She then shifts the discussion into grounding theory, abstract objects, and a range of issues that are not relevant to the chapter at all. She's not engaging at this point. She's just changing the subject. The chapter is not attempting to explain how numbers relate to divine cognition. It is making a straightforward metaphysical distinction between contingent and non-contingent being and applying that distinction to candidate gods. Her detour into those topics does not address the argument. It just ignores it. A central confusion in her review is the equivocation on the word God. She repeatedly points out that contingent beings have historically been called gods, as though that observation undermines the argument. But the argument never denies that people use the word loosely. It draws a distinction between a being that people happen to worship and the being that would actually function as the ultimate ground of reality. Those are not the same thing. If someone wants to call a finite dependent being a god, that does nothing to show that such a being can serve as the non-contingent source of all contingent existence. She does not engage that distinction. She again ignores it. Her treatment of contingency follows the same pattern. She notes that I did not provide an academic citation for the definition, and that observation is fair as far as it goes. But then, she treats the absence of a citation as though the concept itself was arbitrary. That doesn't follow at all. Authors routinely state working definitions in their own words, and the relevant question is whether the definition coheres and whether the argument built on it succeeds. She does not stay with that question. She treats the lack of a citation as though it carries argumentative weight, and it doesn't. The same misrepresentation appears in her response to the clumsy fool God. She says, in effect, so what if such a God is contingent? I am contingent and I exist. But I never argued that contingent beings do not exist. I argued that a contingent being cannot serve as the ultimate non-contingent source of reality. That is the claim she needs to address. Pointing out that contingent beings exist does not engage that claim at all. She also isolates terms from their conceptual framework and then redefines them to suit her own irrelevant purposes. When the chapter speaks of the ultimate source as infinite rather than finite, she reduces infinite to mere temporal duration and then suggests that a being could simply exist forever. But the distinction in view is not about duration alone. It is about dependence, derivation, and ultimacy. By narrowing the term, she critiques a weaker claim than the one I actually make. The most obvious misrepresentation appears in her treatment of the cosmic deceiver. She claims the argument fails because deception could occur in ways other than ideas placed in people's minds. And then she pivots to irrelevant young Earth issues, distant starlight, radioactive decay, and repeated assertions that God would be monkeying with the laws of nature. That language is hers and not mine. I never said God monkeys with the laws of nature. But more importantly, it doesn't even begin to address the argument. The point of the cosmic deceiver section is epistemic, not empirical. If the ultimate source of our cognitive faculties is systematically producing false beliefs, we have no reliable means of distinguishing truth from falsehood. That's the point that she is completely missing or ignoring. It's not a catalog of every conceivable method of deception. She does not engage that point. She replaces it with a separate objection drawn from a different debate and then criticizes the chapter for not answering what it was never meant to answer. Her treatment of the moral argument follows the same pattern. She argues that because morality is not explicitly included in the definition of non-contingent being, an absolutely evil God could satisfy the definition just as easily as a good God. But the argument does not rest on inserting morality into a definition by stipulation. It rests on the idea that moral corruption entails defect, instability, and susceptibility, all of which are incompatible with the kind of independent, immutable ultimacy required of the first cause. She does not engage that reasoning. She simply notes that the definition does not contain the word moral, as though that settles the matter. When she proposes that the singularity could be the non-contingent source, she offers no argument for that claim. She names a physical state and treats it as though it was entirely sufficient and flawless. But naming a state does not show that it is necessary, non-derived, or capable of determining the regress of contingent causes. She redefines the question and then fails to answer it. Her modal reasoning also contains a basic error. She suggests that if a contingent being does not exist in some possible world, then there is no infinite regress involving that being in that world, and she draws conclusions from that about regress in general. That move confuses what is possible in one world with what is actual in another. Likewise, her appeal to relativity and Minkowski space does not touch the argument it is meant to answer. The chapter explicitly frames the issue in terms of time or condition. The point is not about temporal sequence within an already existing space-time manifold. It is about the impossibility of deriving being from absolute non-being. Her response does not engage that principle. It ignores it. She sees the phrase time or condition and thinks all it says is time. There is another confusion in her review that needs to be addressed directly. She repeatedly appeals to examples from cosmology and physics and then concludes that God would have to monkey with the laws of nature, as though that establishes divine deception. Even if her characterization of the data were granted for the sake of argument, it would not show that God is deceptive. It would show, at most, that certain interpretations of physical data, interpretations that are already filtered through naturalistic assumptions, are unreliable and do not establish scientific or historical fact. That is a completely different claim. Unreliable inference is not the same thing as divine act of deception. Her reasoning quietly assumes that raw physical data, when combined with naturalism, yield settled scientific fact. It does not. But that assumption is doing all the work. But that is precisely what is in dispute. The data do not interpret themselves. They are read within a framework. If the framework cannot produce reliable conclusions, then the conclusions cannot be treated as established fact. That does not imply that reality is deceptive. It shows that the interpretive method is insufficient to ground the claim being made. Young universe theory, whatever one thinks of it, does not entail that God implants false beliefs or structures the world in order to mislead rational agents. It challenges the inference from observed data to long-age conclusions. That is an epistemic dispute about whether the method yields reliable knowledge, not a claim that God is engaged in deception. So when she invokes distant starlight or radioactive decay and then concludes that God would have to be deceiving us, she moves beyond anything I argue in the chapter. She signs up for a separate debate, assumes a particular interpretive framework, and then attributes deception to God when that framework is questioned. And more importantly, it does not touch the argument I actually make. The point about a cosmic deceiver concerns the conditions required for knowledge. If the source of our cognitive faculties systematically produces false beliefs, then we lose any reliable basis for distinguishing truth from falsehood. That is the issue. Her appeal to disputed interpretations of physical data does not engage the point at all. She makes the point that adding a citation for the Loftus debate would strengthen the book for readers who want to track the source. But the absence of that citation does not undermine the argument. The chapter does not hinge on Loftus as an individual. I explicitly refer to Loftus and others because the objection is not unique to him. It is a common line of critique. If you want examples, Google is your friend. The argument stands independent of any single source. Now, Kelly's review does point out a serious error in the chapter, and it's perfectly fair for her to ask for correction. There is a sentence where I use the word criteria that should have been criterion. I am forever in her debt. But she never addresses the argument. She runs away from it.
Run away!
Again and again, she moves away from the actual claim, introduces a different claim, and then argues against that instead. When the argument turns on contingency, she answers by pointing out that contingent things exist. When the argument distinguishes between a being called God and the ultimate ground of reality, she treats that distinction as though it were a denial of language. When the argument raises an epistemic problem about deceiving sources of cognition, she pivots to cosmology and imports language that does not appear in the text. When the argument concerns non-contingent ultimacy, she names an unrelated physical state and treats that as an explanation. That is not engagement, it is avoidance. If she wants to challenge the argument, she needs to meet it where it stands. She needs to show that a contingent being can function as the non-contingent ground of contingent reality, or that the regress does not require termination, or that a systematically deceptive source can still underwrite knowledge. Those are the pressure points. She doesn't address them, and there's a reason for that. She can't.